Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of How I Built It, the podcast that asks, how did you build that? Today's episode is going to be a little different. It's just me talking to you about all the great stuff that I learned at Podcast Movement. And one of my takeaways was actually around doing episodes in this style. I started talking about it before I went to Podcast Movement. I talked to a few folks at Podcast Movement, and I'm going to start experimenting more with this show. So if you like these types of shows, please let me know on Twitter at jcasabona or by emailing me, joe@howibuilt.it. But before we get into the takeaways, I also wanted to let you know about a new workbook I've created for launching your own podcast. I get a lot of questions around this. How can people start podcasts like mine, or people want to get into podcasting more? So this workbook will help you determine the topic and format. It includes episode worksheets, checklists, and more. And if you've been thinking about launching your own podcast, this free resource will be super helpful. You can get it at howibuilt.it/liftoff. That's howibuilt.it/LIFTOFF. All right, now before we get on with the show, here is a word from one of our sponsors, Ahoy. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Ahoy, the easiest way to increase customer engagement on your WordPress site. Install Ahoy, create a message box, configure where to display it, and start seeing conversions come in. You can create messages for cart abandonment, upsells and cross-sells, custom support, and so much more. Ahoy's flexible conditions let you choose exactly where and when you want your message to be displayed. I've recently installed it on my own WooCommerce site, and I've already seen increased engagement. And I know this because of Ahoy's powerful analytics and reporting. You will see ROI within days of installing Ahoy, if not sooner. And that's even more true for listeners of How I Built It. You can get an exclusive 20% discount on any plan. Visit useahoy.com/howibuiltit and use the code HowIBuiltIt at checkout. That's useahoy.com, USEAHOY, useahoy.com/howibuiltit, and the discount code HowIBuiltIt. Use those today. Increase your engagement and sales on your WordPress site. Thanks to Ahoy for their support of this show. All right, so let's get to it. If you don't know, Podcast Movement is a giant podcast conference and expo where about 3,000 attendees come from all over the world to talk about podcasting. It's 4 days of events, talks, workshops, networking opportunities, and parties. And if you've never been, I highly recommend it. I went last year in Philly. I absolutely loved it, and I knew I had to go again this year. And I wasn't disappointed. So before heading to the conference, I wrote down some goals I wanted to accomplish while there. And some of them were networking or personal project related. I wanted to connect with other attendees, promote my courses and my videos, educational content, and things like that. It is a sea full of podcasters, soon-to-be podcasters, and people who are in the market of podcasting. So I wasn't just there to get listeners for my show because we kind of all were doing that. I wanted to differentiate myself by saying like, hey, if you're looking to start your own podcast, I have this new course, or here are some of the things that I do outside of podcasting, like web development and video course creation. But there were other goals as well, where I specifically wanted to learn things and get answers to questions that I had. And from that perspective in particular, I think Podcast Movement was a raging success. Too often I look at a conference, and if I can't tie direct return on investment, direct ROI to it, I'm not necessarily keen on calling it a success. I want to, lock in some work to make sure that the dollars I spent are equal to or more than the dollars, equal to or less than the dollars that I made. But this is what I like about Podcast Movement. There's a whole learning aspect to it. And this year, just like last year, I learned a ton of stuff. And there were 5 major takeaways that I got from Podcast Movement this year, all based around the goals I was trying to accomplish. The first takeaway that I learned is that value converts. And I mean, this is something that if you're a content creator, you know on some level, but it's good to hear it explicitly. It's good to have context around that statement. So the first goal or the first takeaway is that value converts. Between the Patreon workshop that I attended and some of the talks that I went to, particularly the ones that Pat Flynn gave, a common theme was to provide value to whoever you're talking to, your audience. This could be your audience that you're trying to build through free opt-ins. So this could be the audience that you're trying to build through free opt-ins, people you're trying to convert into members or patrons, or even other podcast hosts where you want to be a guest. People are pretty keen on just being sold to. If somebody reaches out to me on my show and they say, I want to be a guest, I can tell pretty quickly if they're just trying to hawk their wares on my show, on my platform, or if they want to provide value to my audience. So people are pretty keen on just being sold to, and you definitely don't want to do that, especially if you're trying to build a long-term relationship. You're not just a traveling salesperson who's trying to make a buck. You are trying to build a business. So you need to show people that your business provides value. One of the best ways that you can provide value is actually the second big takeaway that I had from Podcast Movement, and that is by offering quick wins to your audience. This is something Pat Flynn talked a lot about in the sessions that I saw him speak. He talked about how remit. Man, I'm blanking on the name, but I think it was Get Rich Quote. I Will Teach You How to Be Rich. It was the man behind I Will Teach You How to Be Rich. How Pat early on, maybe 10 years ago, read one of his blog posts about how he could save 20 or 25% on his phone bill instantly. Pat tried it. It worked. That was a quick win. And Pat became a fan of his ever since. So how can you provide an immediate win for people reading or consuming your content? And what I try to do with offering quick wins, I'm going to be more intentional about this, but generally what I try to do is boil the conversation on this show down to a few takeaways and some immediate action that you, the listener, can take. I know that with podcasts, you could be distracted. Maybe you're listening while you're driving or on your commute or doing stuff around the house. So I try to repeat some of the big takeaways that I want for this show. Now, when it comes to my own experiences, the content I consume the most revolves around how quickly I can apply what I've learned. If I can listen to a podcast and then immediately do something to improve my work, I'll be a fan for life. This is Landing Page School podcast is a great example of this. I'd listen to an episode and then immediately do whatever he recommended. Pat Flynn's podcast and Amy Porterfield, all three of those podcasts, they have given me quick wins and very actionable advice in their episodes. The third takeaway of Podcast Movement for me was to be active with my audience. And so engagement with a podcast audience can be difficult because it seems like a one-way street. You don't want to feel like you're yelling into the void because it's not a one-way street. There are lots of ways that you can connect with your audience. Twitter, Facebook, and forums are 3 great avenues that I've seen used and that I've used personally. It's also important to get personal. Know your audience and connect with them. One of my quick wins from Pat's talk is that I started using an app called Bonjoro. It's a free app that lets you send personalized videos to people who become part of your audience. So now when someone buys one of my courses or signs up for my mailing list, they get a personalized video from me where I say their name and everything. I know that this is going to help connect me with my audience even more. Another great piece of advice around this is to highlight people in your community. If I know one of my students is working on something cool, or they've just completed one of my courses and now they're actually applying that, it's worthwhile to have them on the show or my YouTube channel to talk about their work because one, I'm highlighting people from my community, and two, I'm showing the rest of my audience someone that they can maybe more clearly relate to. This episode is brought to you by Pantheon. Starting a new project? Looking for a better hosting platform? Pantheon is an integrated set of tools to build, launch, and run websites. Get high-performance hosting for your WordPress sites, plus a comprehensive toolkit to supercharge your team and help you launch faster. On Pantheon, you get expert support from real developers, best-in-class security, and the most innovative technology to host and manage your websites. You can sign up a new site in minutes with a free account. You only pay when it goes live. That is my second favorite feature to Pantheon, only to the easy ability to create dev, staging, and live servers and push to GitHub. It's very easy to set those things up on Pantheon. So you can head over to pantheon.io today, again, to set up a free account. Pay only when it goes live. Thanks so much to Pantheon for their support of this episode and this season of How I Built It. All right. So now number 4, as far as the takeaways I got from Podcast Movement, is to be where your audience is. In order to be active with your audience, you need to hang out where they hang out. And here's a great example and something that I learned during one of the keynotes at Podcast Movement. I never wanted to put my show on YouTube because I didn't feel it added value. But during this keynote, it was mentioned that, the podcast app that people listen to, that's just one place where the show can live. But if people are moving to YouTube or SoundCloud or Facebook, you're going to want your show to be there as well. So if I have a large portion of my audience who prefers to listen to YouTube videos or Facebook videos, then I should definitely put my show there. It's another channel for people to consume and engage with my content. Similarly, if my students are using Facebook, then that's where I should build a community. I shouldn't try to maybe force them into using forums or Discord or Slack if they don't want to use any of those things. The important idea here is that you shouldn't go where you want to go. You should go where your audience already is. And finally, the last takeaway for me for Podcast Movement is this. Promise only what you're willing to deliver. So finally, when you're working with your community and you're trying to build that community and you're mentioning benefits and extras and things like that, don't just promise what sounds good. If you're going to promise something, make sure it's something you're willing to deliver. Or perhaps a better way to put this is don't make more work for yourself. And here's a great example. When I first launched my Patreon, I promised a bunch of extras, episodes without ads, episodes a week early, weekly webinars. But when nobody came to pledge, except for a couple of people at like some of the lower levels, I wasn't really motivated to deliver on those promises. And I was more stressed out about my Patreon because I'm like, well, now I have to do all of this extra work for like $2 a month. One of the things I did at Podcast Movement was revamp my benefits for my Patreon to make them more in line with work that I can deliver on. And that means that I'll be able to deliver on those benefits, whether I have one patron or 1,000 patrons. So when it comes to the stuff that you're doing for your membership, don't just promise things because they sound good. Promise things because you are willing to deliver on them. So now that I'm back in my office, I am excited to start implementing these lessons. And as a matter of fact, I've already started with Bonjoro, with revamping my Patreon benefits and things like that. So just to recap, the 5 takeaways, the 5 biggest takeaways I got from Podcast Movement 2019 are: create value because good value converts. Offer quick wins to your audience so that they know that you're the real deal and they immediately see that value. Be active with your audience and actually engage with them. Become become part of what they're talking about and let them know that you're there. To do that, number 4, you need to go where your audience hangs out, whether that's Facebook, Slack, Discord, or something else. And finally, the 5th takeaway is only promise what you're willing to deliver. So with that, we're at the end of the episode. If you liked it, please let me know, because I have more episodes like this planned, where I'm talking about maybe takeaways from a conference, or how I personally built something, maybe how you would go about building a podcast site, and other more solo shows where I'm offering one-on-one advice to you. So for the transcript and the show notes for this episode, head on over to howibuilt.it/135. Thanks so much to our sponsors, Ahoy and Pantheon. These shows would not be possible without them. If you want a free workbook on launching your own podcast, head over to howibuilt.it/liftoff. And until next time, get out there and build something.